So this week we'll be covering several topics, one of which is restricted float. It's a little bit different than what we've been doing so far with total float. There's also some themes in here of resource allocation and leveling. We'll also talk about compression and time cost trade-off in a schedule. I think we've talked about the different types of relationships, or logical relationships rather, in a schedule. I think the one that everybody is eluding everybody thus far is the start to finish relationship. I personally believe in the other three: the start to start, the finish to finish, and the finish to start relationships. But just to give you an example of what I can do with a schedule, I can basically start the same relationship or do the same sort of time flow sequence with all three types of relationships. So the first example is start to start. If I put a 4-day lag on that one, that's effectively the same as putting a negative lag on a finish to start relationship, as you might see in activity B, or the second scenario. If I wanted to do a finish to finish relationship, I could simply put a positive lag of 2 days on there, meaning that A ends 2 days prior to the end of B. All three of those scenarios effectively result in the same time amount. So there are more than one way to skin a cat. There are differences, however, when we get into other examples about whether the examples will be interruptible or contiguous. They don't actually say the same thing. So actually, even though they might result in the same time sequence or project duration rather, they're not exactly the same, and they're not the same basically because of the logical relationships that are involved. So these examples are taken from 5.24 and 5.25 from the book. It does give you an example of contiguous versus interruptible relationships. The thing that is different this time around is that you have not one linking relationship but two. So if you look in the interruptible example up top, between A and B, they are linked both start to start and finish to finish. And the best way to find out, or how to calculate through a precedence network, is that you're going to have two dates for finish and start for each of those. The one example that I would refer to over and over and over again is to take, it's in chapter 5 between pages 93 and 94. So if you're trying to figure out how to do forward pass and backward pass on some of these precedence networks, the best way to learn how to do it is follow the example in 93 and 94. That will allow you to iterate two sets of dates for each activity. The main difference here is whether an activity is contiguous or interruptible. Interruptible means just that. It means I can start an activity, take a break, and finish the remainder of the activity later. Contiguous is the opposite of that. It means once I start the activity, I have to go all the way through until it's completed. An example of contiguous activity might be placing concrete, and the specifications require no cold joints. So in order to start once I start the activity, I can't interrupt the activity, take a break, and start again. It has to be a continuous activity. The two scenarios here are identical, except that the one up top is interruptible, the one down below is contiguous. When I work through an example, or use this example to work through pages 93 and 94, setting up two sets of dates, the reason that activity B, the early start and the late start, get pushed forward, or rather to day 4, is simply because the activity is contiguous. Once it starts, it cannot stop, which makes what we call the driving relationship the finish of the activity. So the start is equally critical. It has to start on day 4. but it absolutely must terminate on day 10. And the reason being is because the activity is contiguous. So there's a whole nother dimension of thinking through that. I think reading the textbook's obviously going to be helpful for that. I will be providing some other examples with a video to come. We haven't discussed different types of float up until now. Up until now, we've basically been talking about total float, and with a precedence network, we start getting into other types of float. For example, start restricted float. It's the amount of time we can delay the rest of the work in the activity after it has started without delaying the entire project. So if something has start restricted float, it means that the start of the activity is critical, and the remainder activity I might have a little bit of flexibility or play with that. I can think of, for example, site clearing, for example. I might have the start of that as critical, and even maybe the first few days of that as critical while I clear. I'm probably going to clear like building footprints first and other stuff later. But really only the start of that activity is critical. I can clear the rest of the site with a little bit of flexibility built in. So start restricted float really means that the start of the activity is restricted and there's some float in the remainder of the activity. The opposite is true of finish restricted float. That's the amount of time we can delay the start of the work of an activity or the rest of it that has started, and then finish on time without delaying the entire project. Generally speaking, it's not universally true, but I find it's easier to give examples toward the end of a project with this one. If we're talking about an architect's punch list, for example, I might have some flexibility with when and where I can start that. Obviously I have to have work in place completed, but it absolutely must be finished by a certain date without delaying the successor activities. So finish restricted means essentially that the finish of the activity is critical. Sometimes, especially when an activity is linked via multiple logical relationships, I'll have what we call double restricted float, and that's the amount of time we have to delay the rest of the work in an activity after it's started, then finish on time without delaying the entire project. So this is probably a little bit harder to wrap your head around than just doing a simple critical path method. When we were doing the critical path, the whole activity was critical. If any part of that activity was critical, the whole activity is critical. Same thing with a lot of your software programs. So Primavera will schedule things that way, as will AstaPower Project. If one part of the activity is critical, then the whole sequence becomes critical. Double restricted float, start restricted float, finish restricted float, those are all different concepts. What that says is that there's only a specific part or two specific parts of the activity that are critical. So you could theoretically have an activity that was identified as critical in a software program, but really only the start or finish, or the start and finish are critical, and you have some flexibility with the activity apart from those restrictions. Unrestricted float is the amount of time we can delay all or part of the activity without delaying the entire project. There are calculations for determining all of these, and in the slides that follow, I've got just basically the equations that are laid out on page 100 and 101 of your textbook. So for calculation purposes, the first thing you have to be able to do for a precedence network is to do a forward and backward path, same as critical path. If I start asking you questions on what type of float restriction, there are separate calculations for that. So these are all, for calculation purposes, put both start restricted and finish restricted float into one category. It's called single restricted float. So if you see the term SRF, that's really what that stands for. You do one set of calculations, you do another set of calculations, and then you can start determining whether it's finish restricted or start restricted. So just for the purposes of calculations, SRF refers to single restricted float, which is compared with double restricted float or unrestricted float. So the first thing I do is to see if I've got something that has got double restricted float. So I would take the maximum value of either 0 or the equation within the parentheses. So I do have to be able to determine the early finish, the late start. Duration should be given to you in this case. If the answer is 0, then I would try to differentiate between unrestricted float or single restricted float as under number 2 right there. So again, I do need all my early start, early finish, late start, late finish dates. The difference between unrestricted float or single restricted float, I take the absolute value or the minimum of the unrestricted float. If double restricted float is bigger than 0, you would need to apply these equations. So again, the unrestricted float or the single restricted float, these all should be plug and chug. On the exam, one, it'll be open book, so you should have access to these equations anyways. It's simply a matter of being able to determine which is which. I may go as far as to just give you the dates and see if you can plug through the float calculations by yourself. So as a separate question, independent of being able to do a forward and backward pass, I may just give you the dates and see if you're able to work with these problems right here. Even so, I would recommend reading pages 100 and 101 here. All right, the preceding equations combine start restricted float and finish restricted float and single restricted float. You can distinguish the two types mostly by simple observation or by the following rule. And again, these are just more further differentiation. The test question might refer to what type of float does this example have, and I would be able to expect you to differentiate ultimately by start restricted and finish restricted float. And many of the examples, you can apply these to many of the examples of precedence networks in the book in chapter 5. So if you wanted to just take a single activity and run through all these calculations, you should be able to determine what's start and finish restricted. It gets a little bit more complicated when you introduce the concepts of interruptible versus contiguous activity. Assume that activities cannot be interrupted. That means they're contiguous. Once they start, they must be continued until they are finished. That eliminates all types of restricted float. So the interruptible stuff, and actually that would be an awesome test question right there. If an activity is considered contiguous, what types of float are eliminated? And anything that's like, finish restricted, start restricted, that's eliminated at that point. Do encourage you to read more about interruptible versus contiguous activities in the book, and that is identified on, or described rather, on page 101. So another example, contiguous versus interruptible. Many of these examples, I believe these are 5.24 and 25 out of the book. This is same example as prior, I believe. You'll notice two things about this activity. When you make the activities contiguous, one, in activity B, it shifts the start date back. That's because of two reasons. One, I can't stop that activity once it's started, which makes the driving relationship to finish. The other thing you'll notice is that it backs off the date for C, so it actually affects the duration of the whole entire schedule there. You may wonder why the 12-day duration is so critical right there. That's based on the 4-day late start with a 3-day lag. So 7 and 12, basically if I make that activity contiguous versus interruptible, it ends up affecting the project duration. That right there would be an awesome test question, is does it make a difference in the project duration if the activity is contiguous versus interruptible? The answer is yes. So maybe look for a true or false question along those lines. We've talked about resource allocation before. Just a little bit more about it. There are some stuff about time cost trade. There is some stuff about time cost trade-off in this PowerPoint, so this is relevant for that purpose. Resource allocation, I think we've talked about it before. It's the assignment of the required resources to each activity in the required amount and timing. It's also called resource loading. Anything that we along the lines of labor, equipment, and materials is considered a resource. So if I have, for example, a piece of equipment, maybe I have a track hoe that I need in one part of the site and I need it at another part of the site at the same time, that's what we would call a resource constraint. I can't put the piece of equipment in both places at the same time. I either have to get another piece of equipment or schedule the activities so that they follow each other. I can't do them at the same time. So why this pertains to time cost trade-off is because if I have two pieces of equipment, I can save a lot of time, but I also have to spend money for the additional piece of equipment. So a lot of times as project managers, we'll look at stuff like this, evaluate whether it's cost effective to have a second piece of equipment on site in order to be able to accomplish more work simultaneously. We talked about resource leveling. This is more relevant to people who manage multiple projects. So resource leveling is minimizing the fluctuations in day-to-day resource use throughout the project. It's usually done by shifting non-critical activities within their available float, and it attempts to make the daily use of certain resources as uniform as possible. So if I have a bunch of guys that I pay hourly, say for example carpenters, and they're needed on one job site and I need them there for 40 hours in over 3 days, for example, and then the remaining 2 days of the week they've got nothing to do. That leaves me with some overtime problems. So if I've got these heavy spikes in labor need and I've got nowhere else to put my guys for the second half of the week, a lot of times the way people will level resources, if they've got something that's non-critical, they will position crews on different sites on different days. So maybe I go Monday through Wednesday to a site over on the east side of town, and maybe I go Thursday and Friday over to a site on the west side of town. And that way I'm not having everybody do these gigantic spikes like 60 hours Monday through Wednesday and then nothing on Thursday and Friday. Resource leveling, you're kind of limited and constrained for subcontractors, but that's why it's even more important for subcontractors to plan this way. The general contractor basically controls the master schedule, and you are obligated in a certain sense by contract to follow the schedule that was in the contract. So you signed a contract in quadruplicate. It's got a big old schedule attached to it. You're obligated to follow that schedule as best as you're able. Now, if you look at that schedule in conjunction with maybe the 4 or 5 other projects that you're managing, you might have to kind of figure out the best way and best use of your resources, understand what crews you have available, understand what equipment you have available on any given day. So for subcontractors in particular, I think it's particularly important to plan in that way. And scheduling softwares like Primavera, like Asset Power Project have the ability to help you do things like that. But just for basic understanding, leveling evens out my resource use. We are going to talk about materials management a little bit today. As far as the book's concerned, materials management is defined as the planning and controlling of all necessary efforts to ensure that the correct quality and quantity of materials and equipment are appropriately specified in a timely manner, are attained at a reasonable cost, and are available when needed. My old boss used to say there's nothing worse than a group of construction workers with nothing to do. In large part, that depends on construction crews and construction workers having the necessary materials on site to build with. Now, there are 2 different philosophies for this. One is referred to as the just-in-time theory, which calls for delivering materials at the time of installation only. Materials are not stored on the site, and this is probably relevant. There's 2 different examples I've given here with pictures. One is highway construction, another is kind of like a downtown urban job site. Now, just-in-time materials management applies when I have limited space for laydown. So on highway work, for example, where I'm just building along a road and I don't have really anywhere to store, if it's piping materials, if it's fill, if it's gravel, aggregate, asphalt, any of those things, that would fit more of a just-in-time materials management delivery system. The inventory buffer is, it calls for materials to be purchased, delivered, and stored on site prior to installation. Now the key factor there is that you have to have somewhere to store the materials on site. And oftentimes materials are so big, so bulky. I can think of precast panels that we've stored off site simply because there wasn't room in our laydown yard to do that. So if you get a lot of materials, big materials, you are limited in terms of how much material you can store on site. I would say this site is probably more conducive to an inventory buffer type of setup. There is some room here on the site to store materials. It's not a whole heck of a lot. Right down the bottom center of the shot right there, there's a whole pile of rebar, so they're using, to a certain extent, they're storing some of that material on site so they have it ready and available. Again, the inventory buffer method of materials management only is successful insofar as you have room on site to store the materials. This would be the opposite example. So the just-in-time method, you don't really see a whole heck of a lot of materials being stored on this site. One, because it's a functioning roadway. Two, it's linear in nature, so that kind of is conducive to a just-in-time delivery. So the materials only show up on this job site when they're needed. Acceleration is one of the more controversial elements of scheduling, and the reason acceleration is controversial is because usually there's a financial consequence to acceleration. What does it mean? Accelerating a project means shortening the normal duration of the project schedule. It does not necessarily mean aiming for the shortest possible duration. We often talk about schedule crashing. Schedule crashing is just going full tilt as fast as you possibly can. Schedule crashing basically indicates maximum acceleration. So the reason acceleration is controversial is because oftentimes subcontractors will submit bids on certain durations, which implies certain crew size. It implies no overtime, for example. And as soon as I start talking about acceleration, we might be talking about increasing the crew size. We might also be talking about increased amount of overtime hours. So it can be, you go to a subcontractor and say, we're behind schedule, we need to accelerate. Don't expect that to go as the easiest conversation you ever had. You might have something built into the contract that allows you to accelerate within a reasonable amount of time, but again, speeding up or slowing down has definite financial implications. Why would you accelerate a project? So the contractor's normal finish date and the baseline schedule does not meet the imposed finish date of the contract. Sometimes that's usually known before construction. I can think of several projects that I've been on where we didn't have a contract with a subcontractor, and we ended up purchasing some of the equipment that had super long lead times, and that was so we could effectively meet proper milestone dates. So if the date is already unrealistic, then you have to look at a way to accelerate the project. Two, after starting a project and completing a certain percentage of the work, the contractor realizes the project is behind schedule. In many cases, you can have penalties for that. I have been in that situation also. I remember a couple projects being 3-4 months behind schedule, and it's not a fun place to be in, but firsthand I can tell you that accelerating a project generally concerns overtime and additional hours. Of course, I never got paid overtime because I was a salaried employee, but 80-hour work week is one way of accelerating a project. Number three, in some cases, the contractor may have monetary incentive to finish early. So under a cost plus type contract, other delivery method, the contractor may be able to acquire some type of bonus. So that incentivizes the acceleration of the project. If the economy is good, finishing early may mean starting subsequent project early. As a matter of fact, who doesn't like to have stuff before it was expected? So there is an incentive, a financial incentive for completing things early often, but there's also, the satisfaction that an owner might derive from being handed over a project early. Plus, it means you get to make more money. Not only do you please the owner, but you get to go on and finish more work if you finish early. So how can a schedule be shortened? And these are pretty limited in terms of what you can do, but these are all effective methods. So you can revisit the schedule thoroughly to find any errors or unnecessary logic or constraints. I can tell you that having been behind on one of our projects, we had a scheduling consultant come in and look at our schedule, and simply by tweaking the logical relationships in our schedule, he regained 3 weeks of the schedule. So just by whatever arrows link activity to activity, I can shorten the schedule that way, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. In just your logical relationships, I can save 3 weeks off of an otherwise a really bad delay. I can fast track projects. I think the example that most comes to mind, everybody's got an Ivan story. The bridge that went across Escambia Bay during Ivan, that was an example of a fast track project. They needed that project ultra fast, so they cut through all kinds of red tape. They incentivized the builder. They did multiple shifts. There's a lot of different things you can do, but that project was specifically identified as fast track, and they did everything and anything possible to facilitate the early completion of that. Conduct value engineering and constructability studies. So value engineering, for those of you who don't know, is to look at maybe cost-effective ways of providing the same service or outcome. Constructability surveys, those basically refer to identifying in your head how something goes together, and actually building information modeling has a lot to say for that. I think those of you who have seen some of the building information modeling software see that you have the ability to visualize how things go together. So from a constructability standpoint, if I want to do things efficiently, to be able to visualize it in advance of actually building it is a very valuable asset. Number 4, this is probably the touchiest one of all, work overtime, and I can tell you it's touchy for more than one reason. One, you have to pay your hourly employees more, so more hours per day, more hours per week. There is a tipping point where they suggest that productivity decreases with the more hours worked per week above and beyond basic hours. I think it's usually around 60 hours. And I can attest to having worked 70 and 80 hour weeks in order to catch a schedule up. I'm sure my productivity was not what it would have been on hours 70 through 80 as it might have been if I was doing 30 and 40 hour weeks. So it can deplete your labor pool or your labor resource, but it is one way of shortening a project duration. The other thing, you can offer incentives to workers or crews for improving productivity. That's kind of a double-edged sword right there. Speeding things up, of course, with all these things actually on this PowerPoint slide, you should be looking at through the lens of safety. So can I speed something up? It's not always a question of can I speed something up, but can I speed something up safely? And in many of these instances, if we compromise safety for speed, oftentimes we end up slowing ourselves down anyway. So if I fast track a project, if I've got 3 shifts, if I've got somebody who's been working 80 hours a week, there are plenty of studies out there that show that when somebody's been working for 80 hours a week, they're probably not as safe an employee as they otherwise would be. So I can break that down into having 3 shifts of work as opposed to having somebody work round the clock. But do understand that there is a safety implication for each of these issues right here. Acquire more workers and equipment, that's effectively the same result as working overtime. It's added expense, and nobody really likes that. I want to say there is a caveat there. If I do acquire more workers and equipment, I do pay overtime, there is a chance that I'll finish early, in which case I might actually save money. So there's two ways of looking at it. If I'm behind schedule, almost invariably it's going to cost money. If I do this maybe in a cost plus contract where I have a financial incentive to work early, overtime and more workers and equipment might actually benefit me in the long run, because I'll be paying, if I finish maybe 3 or 4 months ahead of schedule, I don't have to pay 3 or 4 months of people's salaries, or there's no more direct cost to that project for a job site trailer or any of the direct costs that might be involved. So that actually might work to my benefit. Hire a second and possible third shift. We talk about that. There is turnover time or learning curves associated with that. You should always consider that when you're scheduling second and third crew. I can acquire special materials like accelerators for concrete, special equipment. There's nothing like, really things get done efficiently when I have the right tool for the right job. So equipment selection is of paramount importance in efficiency. Most specialty subs will have a good handle on what works best for them, but I can tell you, for example, cutting certain materials that you might not have dealt with before, stainless steel, for example, it obviously requires special cutting equipment. So there are things that do require consideration with respect to schedule and even just the basic power tools I might be using. Improving project management or supervision. I can tell you, having worked under good managers and bad managers, that this makes a world of difference. And granted, some of the people I've worked under use semi-coercive methods to compel performance, but there is a difference between good management and bad management, certainly. And that can refer back to your subcontractors. And say, for example, I'm not trying to criticize these guys having a smoke break or whatever they're doing out on the balcony right there. There's also no guardrail there, you might notice, so it's a safety violation in addition to somebody not actually doing their physical work. But when subcontractors get behind schedule, if you have ability to identify why they got behind schedule, and if they might have been sitting around taking smoke breaks every 15 minutes, they still want to be paid the same amount for not basically fulfilling their obligation to schedule. Camera is probably the most dangerous tool on the job site, and if I can manage and supervise these guys effectively, I got a better shot at keeping on schedule. I think I got several photos of these, people just standing around. You don't have to walk around a job site too long to figure out whether people are being productive or not. There is some downtime, admittedly, but obviously there's other times when people are taking advantage of just working on an hourly rate. I don't know if this is for real. Construction's tiring work and all, but obviously it's not the type of thing you want to see. Other means of improving efficiency. So I can improve communications among parties, and this is kind of the paperwork background story to scheduling. In order to get materials on site and to acquire materials or procure materials, there's a whole paperwork side of that involves the engineer and the architect. It involves submittals, it involves requests for information, any formal letter writing, any relationships that you might have with subcontractors. So if you really want to be effective and efficient on a job schedule, half of that is not just building things effectively or slapping resources on the job site and throwing money at something. Oftentimes the office can enhance schedule and timely delivery of activities and construction simply by improving communications between the design team and the build team. All right, how do I really accelerate a project? The only way I can do it is by shortening the critical path. So anything that's not on the critical path, you might say, well, I can get this non-critical activity done right now, and that's going to shorten the schedule. It's not going to shorten the schedule. The project can only be shortened by shortening the longest path. So to shorten the duration of path, the duration of activity must also be shortened. As a rule of thumb, the activity with the least acceleration cost should be shortened. So here's where the money comes into it. You sit there and look at a critical path, and the only way to shorten the schedule is effectively to shorten the critical path. You might have multiple ways of shortening individual activities. The one you should pick is the one that costs you the least amount of money. Okay, that's an effective way to schedule a project. So every time you make a scheduling decision, it has a financial consequence, is what you should take from that. If the shortened activity falls on more than one path, all the paths within that activity will be shortened. I think that's of no real consequence, really, unless it's the critical path that's being shortened. And again, I've mentioned this earlier, by shortening a schedule, I cut out all kinds of additional costs. So I might be paying more for overtime or additional equipment, but ultimately I might save myself 4 months worth of labor, materials, equipment, relationships with subcontractors and their general conditions, permits, fees, lawyers and consultants, anything that I can attribute as a direct cost of the job, I might have the ability to save money on. That also applies to indirect costs. So eventually my home office might be dealing with my job site. They might be earmarking or identifying costs as overhead, and in that case, the sooner I get off a job, the better it is for everybody, really. General overhead, again, there's a lot of stuff that goes into indirect costs. If we're just talking about the running of a company, the quicker I deliver a project, really, the less expense I have that could be attributable to just that project. All right, so profit usually ranges between 5 and 10%, although it can and does occur outside this range, with bookkeeping and such being what it is. I think there's creative ways of doing that. The profit percentage depends on many project-specific factors, prevailing economic conditions, and the contractor's financial status. So I think for a long time after the Great Recession, the economic conditions, a lot of people were complaining about how everybody was underbidding each other, and really you could get stuff done than owners expected things to be done less expensively than the contractors could make money on. It varies. General rule of thumb is between 5 and 10%. Now, we do talk about contingency. This class is not about bidding strategy, but contingency is effectively an additional sum of money allocated for the unknown events that will most likely occur during the life of a project. And they're generally proportional to the risk taken in the project. So if I'm uncertain about, joining a building together, or meeting in the middle of a bridge project, or layout issues or additional things like that, I might build in a little bit of extra cost into my estimate to make sure that I don't take a hit for it, because if I don't account for it, then I'm going to end up paying for it out of my pocket or my overhead and my profit. So contingency, I can build that into my estimate, but I can also, if I put too much contingency in my estimate, I can price myself out of the bid. So contingency, just for testing purposes, really, we need to understand that is part of what we're doing, part of what's built into an estimate and a schedule, for that matter. How do I choose for what manner of acceleration I want to use? So use accelerating methods that incur the minimal cost or have the lowest cost to benefit ratio. It generally makes sense. Overtime costs a time and a half. Second and third shifts may require additional learning curves. Adding more labor causes more space constraints. Special equipment may need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. It might save you money, it might cost you additional money. So really, it's not as easy as saying, oh, I can shorten the schedule this way. Tell me what it costs in addition to how much time you might save. The activity level, accelerating becomes more difficult. At the project level, the scheduler may have a number of options, and I think that all makes sense. If I've got 20,000 activities in my schedule, and the critical path, follows along maybe 30-40% of those, I got any number of variations that I might be able to work with to shorten that schedule. Schedule slip. So this can obviously cause concern for the owner. It causes a lot of stress on the project management team, especially if the project deadline is critical. For example, if I'm building a casino and the owner expects to be making like $1 million a week, they're not going to be super happy when I show up 3 months behind schedule. So the owner may demand that the contractor adjust the work plan to enable him or her to finish on schedule. Owner must be convinced that the contractor can feasibly do so, or the owner may fire the contractor and hire another contractor to ensure a timely finish. When the contractor adjusts the schedule, it's called a recovery schedule. You have to be careful about recovery schedules, because if in any way it differs from the contract schedule, you can end up being liable, or that can become litigious at times. And I've seen certain instances where contractors bid on a certain amount of work, contractor puts together a recovery schedule, and all of a sudden the subcontractor is no longer able to keep pace. So in order to avoid going under, the subcontractor might sue the contractor, or whatever the case may be. But recovery schedules, if they differ from the construction schedule, they can be difficult to deal with.